The morning of June 15th dawned bright and beautiful over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Riverside Heights in Portland, Oregon. The sky was an unblemished blue, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses and fresh-cut grass. It was the kind of perfect early summer day that made children beg to play outside and parents feel grateful for nature's gift of sunshine. The Mitchell family had lived on Avenue for 5 years, and it had become their sanctuary, a place where they felt safe, protected, and utterly content with their lives. The neighborhood was ideal for raising a family: tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and neighbors who genuinely cared about each other. Mark and Jennifer Mitchell had chosen this area specifically because it felt like the safest, most idyllic place to raise their daughter. They couldn't have been more wrong about one thing: the dangers lurking just behind their neighbor's fence. Sarah Mitchell was 7 years old, with long curls that bounced when she walked and sparkling blue eyes that radiated innocence and joy. She was in 2nd grade at Riverside Elementary, where her teachers described her as exceptionally bright, kind-hearted, and a natural leader among her peers. Sarah loved reading, drawing, and playing elaborate imaginative games where she pretended to be a princess, a veterinarian, or an astronaut exploring distant planets. Her favorite possession in the entire world was a stuffed white bunny named Mr., which she'd received as a gift from her grandmother. The bunny had traveled with Sarah everywhere: to school, to her best friend Emma's house, even on family vacations to the Oregon coast. Mr. had become an extension of Sarah herself, a comfort object that represented the security and happiness of her childhood. On that fateful Tuesday afternoon, Sarah had asked her mother if she could play outside in the front yard. It was 2:47 p.m., roughly an hour after school had ended and Sarah had arrived home on the bus. Jennifer Mitchell was inside preparing dinner. She planned to make Sarah's favorite meal, chicken nuggets with sweet potato fries, while Sarah played outside, fully visible through the large bay window. Sarah wore her favorite outfit that day: a pink sundress with small white flowers and white sneakers that lit up when she walked. She carried Mr. clutched against her chest, humming the Let It Go song from Frozen, her current obsession. She had watched the movie 17 times in the past month, and she knew every word, every note, every inflection of the song perfectly. The front yard was fenced, but the fence was old and had begun to deteriorate over the years. Several boards had cracked or warped, and there was a gap approximately 18 inches wide where 2 boards had separated from the supporting posts. The Mitchells had mentioned to their neighbor, James Richardson, that the fence needed repair, but Richardson had shrugged it off, saying he would get to it eventually. Richardson lived directly next door with his German Shepherd, a massive dog named Kaiser. Kaiser was a beautiful animal on the surface: sleek black and tan fur, alert, intelligent eyes, and an athletic build that spoke to careful breeding. But beneath that handsome exterior lurked something darker: an aggressive, unpredictable temperament that had been growing worse over the past 18 months. Kaiser had belonged to James Richardson for 4 years. Richardson was a 53-year-old man who worked as an insurance adjuster and had minimal interest in proper dog training or behavioral management. He kept Kaiser primarily confined to the backyard, rarely taking him for proper walks or engaging him in meaningful exercise. Over time, the dog's frustration grew. More concerning, Richardson had allowed Kaiser to develop what dog behaviorists call fence aggression, an obsession with charging at the fence, barking ferociously at anything that moved on the other side. Dogs walked by, children played nearby, and Kaiser's rage intensified with each passing month. The neighbors had complained multiple times. Animal control had received at least 6 documented complaints about Kaiser's aggressive behavior over the past year. An officer had even visited Richardson's property twice, citing him for improper containment and requesting that he secure the dog more appropriately. But Richardson either ignored the warnings or made minimal, temporary adjustments. What made the situation even more dangerous was that the fence gap had actually been noticed by Richardson himself. During a rainstorm 3 weeks earlier, Kaiser had squeezed through that very gap, escaping into the neighborhood. A kind neighbor had captured Kaiser and returned him to Richardson, who had simply shrugged and tossed a piece of broken wood at the gap without properly securing it. He never fixed it permanently. He seemed almost indifferent to the danger his aggressive dog posed to his neighbors, particularly the neighborhood children. At 2:53 p.m., Sarah bent down to pick up Mr., who had tumbled from her arms as she performed a dramatic spin to accompany the Let It Go song. At that exact same moment, Kaiser was on the other side of the fence, agitated and frustrated by the heat and confinement. He had noticed movement, the flutter of Sarah's pink dress, the motion of her small body. For a dog with Kaiser's temperament, these stimuli were like throwing gasoline on a fire. Kaiser launched himself at the fence with tremendous force, his muscular frame slamming against the weathered boards. The gap was wide enough. With one powerful lunge, Kaiser squeezed through, his body scraping against the rough wood, and suddenly he was free, loose in the Mitchells' front yard and face to face with 7-year-old Sarah. What happened next took only seconds, but those seconds would alter the trajectory of Sarah's entire life. Kaiser didn't bark or growl as a warning. Instead, he charged directly at Sarah with a focused intensity that spoke to predatory instinct. Sarah's brain had no time to process what was happening. She saw a large, dark shape hurtling toward her, and she froze, a natural response in young children when confronted with danger they cannot comprehend. Kaiser's powerful jaws closed around Sarah's left arm, his teeth puncturing skin and tearing through the soft tissue beneath. He shook his massive head violently, as if Sarah were a toy to be destroyed, and she was thrown backward onto the grass. She screamed, a sound so primal, so filled with terror and pain, that it cut through the peaceful afternoon like a knife. Kaiser released his grip on her arm only to bite her left leg, sinking his teeth deep into her thigh. Sarah's screams intensified, and her mind flooded with chemicals, adrenaline, cortisol, fear. She thrashed beneath the dog, desperately trying to escape, but she was no match for Kaiser's strength and aggression. Blood poured from her wounds, soaking into her favorite pink dress, creating a stark crimson stain that stood out against the white flowers. Jennifer Mitchell heard the screams from inside the kitchen and froze, her maternal instincts immediately recognizing that something catastrophically wrong was happening. The sound didn't sound like a normal childhood cry or complaint. It sounded like genuine mortal terror. She dropped the cutting board she was holding and ran toward the front door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When she reached the front porch and saw her daughter bleeding beneath Kaiser's snapping jaws, time seemed to stop. Sarah's pink dress was soaked with blood. Her small body was helpless beneath the massive dog, and Jennifer's world exploded into chaos and maternal fury. Jennifer screamed Kaiser's name and ran directly at the dog, grabbing his collar and pulling him away from Sarah with strength born of pure desperation and protective love. Kaiser snarled and snapped at Jennifer, nearly biting her hand, but she held firm. Mark Mitchell came running from the garage where he'd been working on a woodworking project, and together he and Jennifer managed to force Kaiser back through the fence, slamming the gap shut with their own bodies. Jennifer immediately called 911, her voice shaking as she described the attack to the dispatcher. She scooped Sarah into her arms, cradling her bleeding daughter against her chest, whispering reassurances even as her own mind reeled with shock and horror. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and as they carefully placed Sarah on a stretcher, Jennifer noticed her daughter's eyes, wide, glassy, and filled with a trauma so deep it seemed to reach into her very soul. Sarah wasn't just injured. Something fundamental had broken inside her. The innocent, joyful 7-year-old who had been humming, Let It Go just moments before had been replaced by a terrified child whose sense of safety had been shattered forever. The Oregon Health and Science University Hospital emergency room was a blur of fluorescent lights, urgent voices, and the overwhelming smell of antiseptic and fear. Sarah arrived in the ambulance at 3:14 p.m., her small body carefully secured on a pediatric stretcher, her wounds wrapped in temporary bandages already beginning to seep blood. The paramedics had done an excellent job stabilizing her during the 7-minute ride to the hospital, but Sarah's condition was serious enough to warrant immediate evaluation by the trauma team. Jennifer sat beside her daughter in the ambulance, holding her hand, whispering constant reassurances. "You're going to be okay, baby. The doctors are going to help you. Mommy's right here. You're safe now." But even as the words left her lips, Jennifer knew they weren't entirely true. Sarah wasn't safe. Her daughter had just been savagely attacked by a predatory animal, and no amount of maternal comfort could undo what had been done. Mark followed in their car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he'd heard those screams, the moment he'd rounded the corner and seen his precious daughter bleeding beneath that massive dog. His eyes blurred with tears as he drove, rage and guilt warring within him. Why hadn't he fixed that fence? Why hadn't they pushed harder on James Richardson to secure his dog? Why? These questions would haunt Mark for months to come, part of the guilt that comes with being a parent unable to protect a child from danger. At the hospital, Sarah was taken directly to the trauma bay, where Dr. Michael, the attending emergency physician, began his assessment. Doctor was experienced in animal bite injuries, having treated dozens of dog bite victims over his 20-year career. But something about this case struck him differently. Sarah was so small, so young, and her wounds were so severe. The bite on her left arm had created a jagged laceration approximately 4 inches long, with visible tissue damage beneath the skin. The bite on her left thigh was even more concerning. It was deeper, covering a larger surface area, and had punctured dangerously close to her femoral artery, the major blood vessel that supplied blood to her leg. Had Kaiser's teeth been angled just slightly differently, Sarah could have bled to death in her front yard. "We need to get her to surgery," Doctor told the assembled surgical team. "These wounds need to be thoroughly cleaned and sutured. We also need to assess for any deeper tissue or muscle damage." Doctor spoke with calm authority, but his eyes betrayed his concern. He'd learned long ago not to let the emotional weight of pediatric trauma cases overwhelm him, but cases involving innocent children always hit differently. Sarah was wheeled into operating room 3 at 3:47 p.m., with Jennifer and Mark permitted to walk with her to the surgical doors. Sarah was conscious but heavily sedated, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She'd been given powerful pain medications in the emergency room, but they didn't numb the emotional terror she was experiencing. As the surgical doors swung shut, separating her from her parents, Sarah's eyes widened in panic, and she reached out her uninjured arm toward her mother, a silent plea not to be abandoned in this scary place. Jennifer's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as she watched her daughter disappear behind those doors. Mark and Jennifer sat in the surgical waiting room for 3 hours and 42 minutes. Neither of them spoke much. Jennifer held a cold cup of coffee that she didn't drink, just held it for something to do with her trembling hands. Mark stared at a television mounted on the wall, not processing anything that was being broadcast. Both of them were trapped in the nightmare of what had happened, running through the attack over and over in their minds, each moment crystallized in devastating clarity. Other families in the waiting room occasionally glanced at them, recognizing the particular hell that comes with having a child in surgery. One elderly woman approached Jennifer and said, "I've been through this. My grandson was hit by a car when he was 8. He's 22 now and in college. They recover. They're resilient. Your daughter will be okay." Jennifer appreciated the sentiment, but she couldn't quite believe it. How could Sarah ever be okay after this? When Doctor finally emerged from the operating room at 7:29 p.m., he was still wearing his surgical mask around his neck and his blue surgical scrubs. He looked tired but cautiously optimistic. "The surgery went well," he told Mark and Jennifer. "We've cleaned both wounds thoroughly and inserted 47 stitches total, 28 in her arm and 19 in her thigh. There was some muscle tissue damage, but nothing that won't heal with proper care and physical therapy. We've also given her prophylactic antibiotics because dog bites carry a high risk of infection. She's being monitored in our pediatric intensive care unit. You can see her in about 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes felt like an eternity. When they were finally allowed into the PICU, Sarah was unconscious, her small frame almost swallowed by the hospital bed. Her left arm was heavily bandaged, as was her left thigh. Monitors beeped around her, tracking her heart rate, oxygen saturation, and blood pressure. An IV line ran into her right arm, delivering fluids and pain medications. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable, so utterly unlike her normal, vibrant self. Jennifer moved to the side of the bed and gently took Sarah's uninjured hand, pressing it to her lips and kissing her soft skin. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." Mark stood at the foot of the bed, his jaw clenched, his entire body rigid with barely contained rage and anguish. The man who had failed to fix his fence, the man who had allowed an aggressive dog to roam his yard with inadequate containment. That man was at home right now, probably having dinner or watching television, completely indifferent to the devastation he'd caused. Mark felt a burning need for justice, a desperate urgency to make sure that what happened to Sarah never happened to another child. Over the next 3 days, Sarah remained in the hospital. The first night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., she woke up in obvious pain and confusion, not immediately remembering where she was or why. She looked around the unfamiliar room with its beeping machines and harsh lighting, and panic seized her. She tried to move her left arm and gasped in pain. Immediately, Jennifer was at her side, pressing the call button and whispering soothing words. A nurse arrived within moments and adjusted Sarah's pain medication, and she drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The second and third days were slightly better physically but emotionally traumatizing. Hospital staff moved in and out, checking her wounds, changing her bandages, administering medications. Each time Sarah woke up, there was a moment of blessed forgetfulness before the reality of what had happened crashed down upon her. The physical pain was significant but manageable with medication. The psychological pain, however, was something else entirely, something much deeper and much harder to treat. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Sarah, a pediatric psychologist on staff at the hospital, came to evaluate Sarah. Doctor was kind and gentle, with a soft voice and warm eyes that seemed to understand the terror Sarah was experiencing. She sat on the edge of the bed and asked Sarah simple questions about how she was feeling. Sarah, still heavily medicated and exhausted, could barely articulate her thoughts. But Doctor noticed something that would become increasingly apparent over the coming months. Sarah exhibited classic signs of acute trauma. Her eyes had a distant, haunted quality. Her body tensed at unexpected sounds. When a nurse unexpectedly touched her during a bandage change, Sarah flinched violently and cried out in fear disproportionate to the actual stimulus. "I'd like to continue working with Sarah after she's discharged," Doctor told Mark and Jennifer. "What she's experienced is significant trauma, and while children are remarkably resilient, early intervention with therapy can make a tremendous difference in her long-term recovery." When Sarah was finally discharged on the fourth day, Jennifer dressed her carefully in loose-fitting clothes to accommodate her bandages. Sarah moved slowly, carefully, as if her body had aged 40 years overnight. She held Mr., her beloved stuffed bunny, clutched tightly against her chest. As they left the hospital, Sarah asked in a small, trembling voice, "Will Kaiser come back?" Jennifer's heart broke. Her daughter wasn't just physically traumatized. She was living in fear, constantly hypervigilant to danger. "No, baby," Jennifer promised, even as she secretly wondered how they would keep that promise. "You're safe now. We're going to make sure you're safe." But as they drove home, Sarah stared out the window with haunted eyes, and Jennifer realized that the most difficult part of their journey was only just beginning. 6 weeks had passed since Sarah's discharge from the hospital, and the physical wounds had begun to heal. The stitches had been removed 2 weeks earlier, leaving behind angry red scars that would eventually fade but would never completely disappear. The wounds on her arm and leg were healing well, according to doctor during her follow-up appointment. "The tissue is knitting beautifully," he'd said with professional satisfaction. "In 6 months to a year, these scars will fade significantly." But as Jennifer listened to the doctor's optimistic assessment, she knew that the physical healing was only a small part of Sarah's recovery. The invisible wounds, the psychological scars, were far more severe and far more complicated to treat. The transformation in Sarah's behavior had been dramatic and heartbreaking. The vibrant, joyful girl who had sung "Let It Go" in her front yard had been replaced by a withdrawn, anxious child who barely resembled her former self. Sarah now refused to leave the house under almost any circumstances. She clung to Jennifer constantly, unwilling to let her mother out of her sight even for brief moments. When Jennifer went to the bathroom, Sarah would sit outside the door, calling out periodically to make sure her mother was still there. When Jennifer tried to go upstairs to change clothes or get something from a bedroom, Sarah followed her every step, her breathing quickening if Jennifer moved too far away. "It's separation anxiety," Dr. Sarah explained during one of their weekly therapy sessions. "It's a natural response to the trauma Sarah experienced. She learned that terrible things can happen in an instant, in a place she thought was safe. Now she needs constant reassurance that her primary caregiver, her mother, is nearby and can protect her." Doctor was working with Sarah using play therapy, a technique where children work through trauma by acting out scenarios with toys and dolls. Sarah had a toy dog and a toy girl, and during their sessions, she would repeatedly act out variations of the attack, her small hands controlling the toy dog as it lunged at the toy girl, over and over again. Doctor explained that this repetitive acting out was Sarah's brain's way of trying to process and integrate the traumatic experience. At school, things were deteriorating rapidly. Sarah's second-grade teacher, Miss, had been nothing but supportive and understanding, but she was deeply concerned about the changes she was witnessing. Sarah had always been a star student, quick to raise her hand, eager to participate, full of creative ideas. Now Sarah sat quietly at her desk, barely participating in class discussions. Her grades, which had been straight A's, had plummeted to C's and D's. During group projects, Sarah would work mechanically, without enthusiasm or engagement. Worst of all was what happened during recess. Riverside Elementary School had a large, beautiful playground with climbing structures, swings, and a field for running and playing games. Before the attack, Sarah had been one of the most active children on the playground, leading games of tag and hopscotch, laughing with her friends, fully engaged in the joys of childhood play. Now, during recess, Sarah sat alone on a bench near the school building, watching the other children play with hollow, haunted eyes. Miss often found her sitting there, shaking, even on warm days when Sarah would break into a cold sweat seemingly without reason. The turning point came when Sarah's best friend Emma invited her to her 8th birthday party at Park, a large urban park with open green spaces, playground equipment, and walking trails. Before the attack, Sarah would have been thrilled. Emma was her closest friend. They'd been inseparable since kindergarten. But when Jennifer mentioned the party to Sarah, her daughter's entire body went rigid with fear. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking. No, I can't go to the park." "Why not, sweetie?" Jennifer asked gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "There are dogs at the park," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Dogs are everywhere. Someone could let their dog off the leash and it could attack me like Kaiser did. I don't want to die, Mommy. I don't want to get hurt again." Jennifer's heart shattered. Her 7-year-old daughter was living in a state of constant hypervigilance, her mind every scenario, imagining worst-case outcomes in situations where the actual danger was minimal or non-existent. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, Jennifer went into the kitchen and wept into her hands, feeling helpless and desperate to find some way to help her suffering daughter. The nightmares were perhaps the most traumatic aspect of Sarah's deteriorating mental health. Every single night, Sarah would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart racing as if she were back in that front yard with Kaiser's teeth tearing into her flesh. The nightmares varied slightly. Sometimes Kaiser was attacking her. Sometimes he was attacking her mother or father. Sometimes he was chasing her through the house or the school or the neighborhood. The content changed, but the terror remained constant and overwhelming. Mark and Jennifer took turns sitting by Sarah's bedside during the night, comforting her, helping her return to sleep, listening to her whisper fears in the darkness. Jennifer began suffering from sleep deprivation herself. She would lie in bed next to Sarah, listening to her daughter's breathing, ready to spring into action the moment Sarah woke up gasping and screaming. The emotional and physical exhaustion was taking its toll on both parents. Mark struggled with his own guilt and rage. He'd been the one who hadn't pushed hard enough about fixing the fence. He'd been the one who'd brushed off Jennifer's concerns about Kaiser's aggressive behavior. These thoughts consumed him. He found himself imagining confrontations with James Richardson, mental scenarios where he demanded justice or threatened violence. He had to consciously stop himself from going over to Richardson's house. Jennifer worried about her husband's emotional state. She could see him deteriorating under the weight of guilt and anger. By August, approximately 2 months after the attack, Sarah had developed what doctor diagnosed as specific phobia related to dogs, combined with generalized anxiety disorder. Sarah now refused to leave the house almost entirely. When family members insisted she attend necessary appointments, she would become physically ill: nausea, diarrhea, stomach cramps, headaches. The anxiety was manifesting in her body, making even necessary outings a traumatic ordeal. Sarah's bathroom habits had also changed in a troubling way. During times of high anxiety, she would have accidents, occasionally having to wear pull-ups at night despite having been fully potty trained for years. This regression was a common response to severe trauma in children, but it added another layer of embarrassment and shame to Sarah's already fragile emotional state. One afternoon, Jennifer overheard her daughter talking to Mr. the Stuffed Bunny. "I'm sorry I can't play anymore," Sarah whispered to the toy. "I'm sorry I'm not brave like you. I'm sorry I'm broken." The words were so heartbreaking, so revealing of the depth of Sarah's emotional suffering, that Jennifer had to leave the room to cry in private. It was at this point that Mark made a decision. He couldn't fix his daughter's trauma through comfort and reassurance alone. They needed to fight back, to demand accountability, to seek justice, to make sure that what happened to Sarah never happened to another child. He called his brother-in-law, who worked in law, for a recommendation for a personal injury attorney. That recommendation led him to David, a lawyer with a reputation for fighting against impossible odds and winning. Mark scheduled a consultation without telling Jennifer, his mind already made up that they needed to pursue legal action. He didn't realize that this decision, motivated entirely by his desire to protect his daughter and seek justice, would be the catalyst that would eventually lead to Sarah's healing and transformation. But not before things would get much worse. The offices of and associates occupied the entire 5th floor of a modern high-rise building in downtown Portland, Oregon. The space was carefully designed to project both competence and approachability: glass walls, modern furniture, and artwork that suggested both success and social consciousness. David's personal office was at the corner of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. But despite the elegant surroundings, was a man who genuinely cared about his cases, particularly those involving vulnerable populations like children. David was 58 years old and had been practicing personal injury law for 32 years. He'd built his reputation on taking cases that other attorneys considered unwinnable and transforming them into victories. He'd successfully sued major corporations, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals who thought their money could protect them from accountability. His win rate was exceptional, but it wasn't the money or the accolades that drove him. Was motivated by a deep sense of justice, by the belief that powerful institutions should be held accountable when they harmed vulnerable people. He'd taken several cases involving dog attacks over his career, and each one had infuriated him in the same way: the casual indifference of dog owners who created dangerous situations and then acted surprised when tragedy struck. When Mark Mitchell called to schedule a consultation, his office administrator booked him for the following week. On the day of the appointment, Mark arrived at the office nervous and uncertain. He'd never been involved in a lawsuit before, and he worried that his case might not be strong enough, that they might not be able to get justice for Sarah. Jennifer had wanted to come but couldn't leave Sarah alone. Their daughter had developed such severe anxiety that neither parent felt comfortable leaving her without one of them present. So Mark sat alone in the waiting room, holding a folder containing photographs of Sarah's injuries, copies of the hospital discharge papers, the police report, and medical bills totaling over $47,000. When David emerged from his office to greet Mark, the attorney's demeanor immediately put him at ease. Was a tall, distinguished-looking man with kind eyes and an air of quiet confidence. He wore an expensive suit but carried himself without pretension. He invited Mark into his office and listened without interruption as Mark described the attack, Sarah's injuries, her ongoing psychological trauma, and the family's anguish. "Tell me about your neighbor," said, his voice calm and measured. "Tell me everything you know about James Richardson and his dog." Mark recounted everything: Richardson's indifference to complaints, the animal control citations, the broken fence that Richardson hadn't bothered to repair properly, and most importantly, the fact that this wasn't Richardson's first incident with his dog. "My investigator will need to dig into the history," said, his eyes narrowing with interest. "But I'm already sensing that Richardson may have had previous incidents with that dog." Opened a leather portfolio and began taking detailed notes. He asked specific questions about the timeline of events, about neighbors who had complained about Kaiser, about whether there was any documentation of those complaints. He asked about Sarah's medical care, her therapy, her current condition. After an hour of detailed questioning, set down his pen and looked directly at Mark. "Here's what I want you to understand," said firmly. "Your neighbor created a dangerous situation. He had a dog that was documented as aggressive. He had warnings from animal control. He had a broken fence that he knew posed a risk, and he did nothing to protect his neighbors or their children. When that dog attacked your daughter, it wasn't an accident or bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of negligence, indifference, and irresponsibility. We're going to hold him accountable." "What about the insurance company?" Mark asked. "Won't they just protect him?" Smiled grimly. "Insurance companies protect themselves first and their policyholders second. They'll try to minimize the payout, they'll claim the dog was provoked, they'll argue that your daughter was somehow at fault. But we're going to prove them wrong. I want to warn you, though, this could take a while. These cases often take 18 months to 2 years to resolve, and we need to be prepared that this might go to trial." "I don't care how long it takes," Mark said, his voice firm. "I want justice for Sarah. I want to make sure this never happens to another child." Over the next several weeks, David's investigative team sprang into action. Employed a full-time private investigator named, a former police detective with connections throughout Portland's law enforcement community. Began pulling court records, animal control reports, and any documentation related to James Richardson's property in Kaiser. What discovered was even more damaging than had anticipated. In the past decade, James Richardson had settled 3 previous dog bite cases, all involving Kaiser or Richardson's previous dog. The settlements totaled approximately $40,000. More damaging was that one of the previous cases involved a child, a 10-year-old boy who had suffered a minor bite on his hand but had been traumatized by the experience. Richardson had settled that case quietly, paying the family $8,000 to go away. But the most explosive discovery came when obtained copies of emails between Richardson and his homeowner's insurance company. In one email dated 14 months before Sarah's attack, Richardson wrote to his insurance agent, "Kaiser has been showing some aggressive tendencies lately. He's unpredictable around other animals and has been fence-aggressive with the neighbor's kids. I'm worried he might bite someone if he gets loose, but I can't afford to pay for a professional trainer right now." In another email, dated 9 months before the attack, Richardson wrote, "The fence in my backyard has some damage. I've patched it temporarily but haven't done a full repair. I'm aware the dog could potentially get through it if he really tried. I know this is risky, but I'm hoping nothing happens." These emails were smoking guns. They proved that Richardson knew his dog was dangerous. He knew his containment was inadequate, and he'd done essentially nothing to address either problem. He'd accepted the risk and hoped nothing would happen. When Sarah was attacked, it wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was the predictable result of Richardson's deliberate indifference. "This is huge," told Mark when he reviewed the emails. They were sitting in his office again, 3 months after their initial consultation. "This shows that Richardson had actual knowledge of the danger his dog posed. He knew the fence was inadequate. He knew the dog was unpredictable. This transforms this from a simple negligence case into something more serious: gross negligence, possibly even recklessness." The insurance company's initial settlement offer came through in September, roughly 3 months after the attack. It was insulting: $15,000. The amount didn't begin to cover Sarah's medical bills, let alone her ongoing therapy costs, her emotional suffering, or her loss of quality of life. "Absolutely not," told the insurance company's attorney over the phone. "That offer is an insult to my clients. We have documentation of prior incidents. We have emails showing Richardson's knowledge of the danger. We have a severely traumatized child with ongoing psychological injuries. We'll see you in court." When informed Mark and Jennifer of the rejection, he explained his strategy. "They're going to try to wait us out, to hope that we'll take a lower offer eventually. But we're not going to settle cheap. We're going to make them understand that this case will be expensive and difficult for them. We're going to prepare this for trial as if we're definitely going to court." Assembled his trial team. He brought in Dr. Robert Martinez, a veterinary behaviorist who could testify about Kaiser's dangerous temperament and the inadequacy of Richardson's containment measures. He consulted with child psychologists who could speak to Sarah's trauma and her prognosis. He prepared detailed medical records, hospital documentation, and expert testimony about the severity of her injuries and their long-term implications. Over the next several months, Sarah's case became the consuming focus of David's practice. He worked late into the evenings, reviewing documents, strategizing with his investigative team, and preparing for what he increasingly believed would be a trial. He visited the Mitchell family at their home, spending time with Sarah, understanding the human dimension of the case beyond the legal documents and medical records. He saw the fear in Sarah's eyes when she heard unexpected noises. He witnessed her separation anxiety when Jennifer left the room. He understood, in a visceral way, what this attack had cost the family. By the time the trial date was set for January, David was absolutely committed to winning this case. It was no longer just a legal matter. It had become a crusade for justice, a fight to hold a negligent man accountable and to demonstrate to the insurance industry that they couldn't minimize the suffering of innocent children. Knew that Sarah's case would be the most important work he'd done in years, and he was ready to fight with every skill and resource at his disposal. "We're going to win this," told Mark and Jennifer at their final pretrial meeting. "Not just for the money, though I believe you deserve substantial compensation. We're going to win because justice demands it. We're going to win because Sarah deserves it. And we're going to win because the community needs to understand that negligence has consequences." As January approached, Mark and Jennifer felt a cautious sense of hope emerging from the darkness that had consumed their lives since June. The legal battle was about to begin, and though they couldn't know it yet, this battle would become the catalyst for Sarah's healing and the transformation of the entire family's future. Sat at his desk in the investigation firm's office, surrounded by stacks of documents, court files, and legal papers. It was a cold November morning, 3 months before the trial was scheduled to begin, and had been working on the Mitchell case with an intensity that bordered on obsession. As a former homicide detective with the Portland Police Department, had learned to follow evidence wherever it led, to trust his instincts about when something didn't add up, and to dig deeper when he sensed there was more to a story than what appeared on the surface. Had already uncovered the 3 previous dog bite settlements and the incriminating emails between Richardson and his insurance company. But something about those emails nagged at him. The tone suggested that Richardson had been in communication with his insurance company on multiple occasions, that this was an ongoing conversation about Kaiser and the fence, not a one-time disclosure. Decided to dig deeper into the discovery process, requesting additional communications and documents that Richardson's legal team might have tried to minimize or hide. What discovered in early December made his blood boil. Hidden in a stack of emails that the defense team had technically disclosed, but had buried among hundreds of other documents, a tactic known as dumping in legal circles, was an entire chain of communications between Richardson and his insurance agent that painted a picture of deliberate negligence so clear that it was almost shocking. The emails spanned over 2 years and revealed a troubling pattern. In one email from 18 months before Sarah's attack, Richardson wrote, "The German Shepherd has become increasingly unpredictable. I've had neighbors call about aggressive fence behavior. 2 kids were running past my yard yesterday, and the dog went absolutely berserk. He threw himself against the fence with tremendous force. I'm concerned about liability." The insurance agent's response was equally damning. "Mr. Richardson, based on what you're describing, I must advise you to either enroll your dog in professional behavioral training or consider rehoming the animal. Your current homeowner's policy may not cover damages if a dog with a documented history of aggressive behavior causes injury. Please respond to this email confirming receipt of my advice." Richardson never responded to that email. Instead, he ignored it entirely and continued to keep Kaiser, with no professional training, in a yard with an increasingly deteriorating fence. But there was more. Found an email dated exactly 7 months before Sarah's attack, in which Richardson's neighbor, the same neighbor whose fence bordered Richardson's yard, had written to Richardson directly. "James, I've noticed your dog has been extremely aggressive lately. He threw himself against our shared fence yesterday with so much force I thought he'd break through. I'm genuinely concerned about the safety of my children and pets. I strongly urge you to do something about the containment or the dog's behavior." Richardson's response, dated 3 days later, was staggering. "I appreciate your concern, but Kaiser is a good dog. He's just high energy. I'll look into some improvements to the fence, but I can't afford professional training right now. Please don't worry." He never made those improvements. He never looked into them seriously. He simply hoped the problem would go away. Also discovered that Animal Control had cited Richardson not twice, as they'd initially understood, but 6 times over a 3-year period. Each citation was for failure to properly contain an aggressive dog or for allowing the dog to roam at large. Richardson had paid the fines, small amounts, between $100 and $250 per citation, and basically ignored the underlying issues. To Richardson, the fines were simply the cost of doing business, a minor inconvenience that was cheaper than actually addressing the problem. "This is explosive," told David over the phone, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We've got communications spanning years that show Richardson knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the dog was dangerous. He knew the fence was inadequate. He had advice from his insurance company to either train the dog or rehome it, and he consciously, deliberately chose to do nothing. He gambled with his neighbor's safety and lost." Immediately filed a motion with the court, detailing the discovery violations by the defense team. The documents had been technically disclosed but buried among hundreds of pages in a way that suggested intentional concealment. This was a serious ethical violation, and Judge, who would be presiding over the trial, took a very dim view of such tactics. When presented the motion to the judge's face darkened visibly. She called the defense attorney, a slick corporate litigation specialist named Robert Hartford who was being paid handsomely by the insurance company, into her chambers for a private meeting. When Hartford emerged, he looked shaken. Judge had made it clear that she didn't appreciate discovery violations and that any further attempts to hide or obscure evidence would result in serious sanctions. More importantly, the hidden evidence had a profound impact on the defense's strategy. They could no longer argue that Richardson had been an innocent homeowner unaware of his dog's dangerous tendencies. The emails and citations proved knowledge. The communications with his insurance company proved foreknowledge. The defense's position had weakened considerably. At the next settlement conference, the dynamics had shifted dramatically. The insurance company's attorney, looking visibly uncomfortable, made a new offer, $85,000. It was a significant jump from the $15,000 initial offer, but David rejected it immediately. "That's still not sufficient," told the defense team. "My client's daughter has suffered severe trauma. She has ongoing psychological injuries that will require years of therapy. She has permanent scarring. She has lost the ability to enjoy normal childhood activities. The emotional and psychological damages alone far exceed what you're offering." "What are you looking for?" Hartford asked, clearly frustrated. "At minimum, $250,000, responded without hesitation. "But frankly, I think this case is worth more than that. The evidence of your client's deliberate negligence is overwhelming. A jury will be appalled by these communications. They'll understand that this wasn't an accident. It was the predictable consequence of your client's conscious indifference to danger. If this goes to trial, I believe the jury will award substantially more." Hartford's face flushed. He knew was right. The evidence was devastating. "I'll need to discuss with my superiors," Hartford said. Over the next week, Hartford returned with a new offer, $150,000. Still inadequate in its view, but movement in the right direction. Rejected it and reiterated his position, $250,000 minimum, or they would proceed to trial. Meanwhile, Sarah's condition had not improved with the approach of the trial. In fact, knowing that she would have to testify, that she would have to stand up in court and describe the attack, had created new layers of anxiety for her. Doctor had been working extensively with Sarah to prepare her for testimony, using gradual exposure techniques and role-playing scenarios. They practiced with Doctor asking her questions similar to what she might face in court. Sarah would practice answering, and often she would break down in tears, overwhelmed by the memories. Jennifer had written a powerful statement describing Sarah's suffering for the court. She detailed her daughter's nightmares, her separation anxiety, her regression in toilet training, her social isolation, her declining grades. She wrote about the joy that had been stolen from her daughter's childhood, about the way Sarah flinched at unexpected sounds, about her constant hypervigilance and fear. "My daughter used to be a light," Jennifer wrote. "She brought joy and laughter to our home and to everyone who knew her. Now she lives in fear and darkness. James Richardson didn't just injure my daughter's body. He fractured her mind, her sense of safety, and her childhood. That cannot be repaired with money alone, but I want him to understand the full cost of his negligence and indifference." By late December, as the January trial date approached, the insurance company had increased its offer to $200,000. Still rejected it, though he acknowledged that they were getting closer. He believed that once the jury heard Sarah's testimony, once they understood the full scope of her suffering and the complete documentation of Richardson's negligence, they would award far more. On December 28th, met with Mark and Jennifer one final time before trial. Sarah was asleep upstairs, exhausted from a particularly difficult day of nightmare-induced wake-ups and anxiety episodes. "I want you to understand something," told them. "The evidence we have is exceptionally strong. The defense knows it. The insurance company knows it. but they're gambling that a jury might be sympathetic to Richardson, that someone on the jury might minimize the damages, that they might get lucky. We're going to prove them wrong. Sarah's testimony will be crucial. She needs to tell her story in her own words. That's when the jury will understand what this has really cost. Mark took Jennifer's hand. "We're ready," he said. "We're ready to fight for Sarah." As 2025 began, David finalized his trial strategy. He knew exactly how to present Sarah's case. He knew how to make the jury understand that this wasn't just about money. It was about justice, accountability, and protecting children from negligent, indifferent people who valued their own convenience over their neighbor's safety. The trial would be Sarah's opportunity to have her voice heard, to demand accountability, and to begin her long journey toward healing. The pieces were in place. The evidence was overwhelming. And on January 6th, the trial would begin. The courtroom of judge was packed to capacity on the morning of January 14th. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Local news anchors had picked up on Sarah's story, an innocent 7-year-old child brutally attacked by a neighbor's dog, the family fighting for justice against a negligent homeowner and a powerful insurance company. The case had captured the public's imagination, and the community had around the Mitchell family. The gallery was filled with supporters, neighbors, friends, and curious citizens who wanted to witness this trial. David sat at the plaintiff's table, reviewing his notes one final time. He wore an expensive but understated gray suit, the uniform of a serious trial lawyer prepared for battle. Next to him sat Mark and Jennifer Mitchell. Mark's jaw was clenched, his hands folded on the table. Jennifer gripped a tissue, her eyes red from crying. Across the courtroom, Robert Hartford sat with his legal team, looking considerably less confident than he had at previous proceedings. James Richardson sat beside Hartford, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit, his eyes avoiding contact with the Mitchell family. Judge entered at 9:00 a.m. sharp, and everyone rose. Was a woman in her early 60s with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had 20 years of judicial experience and a reputation for running a tight courtroom and punishing discovery violations and ethical misconduct. Her opening comments made clear that she would tolerate no nonsense from either side. The trial began with opening statements. David stood and walked to the jury box, making deliberate eye contact with each juror. The jury consisted of 12 people, ranging in age from a college-aged woman to an elderly man who appeared to be in his 70s. There were several parents among them, and had carefully selected jurors who demonstrated empathy, who had children themselves, who seemed likely to understand the gravity of what had happened to Sarah. "What you will hear in this case," began, his voice calm and measured, "is not a story about an unfortunate accident. It is a story about negligence, indifference, and the deliberate choice by one man to ignore danger, hoping that nothing bad would happen. That man is James Richardson, and his conscious indifference cost an innocent 7-year-old girl her sense of safety, her childhood, and her future. We will prove to you that Richardson knew his dog was dangerous. We will prove that he knew his fence was inadequate. We will prove that he was explicitly warned by animal control, by his insurance company, and by his neighbors, and he chose to do nothing. When that dog attacked Sarah Mitchell on June 15th, it wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of Mr. Richardson's negligence." Held up photographs of Sarah's injuries, the deep lacerations on her arm and leg, the stitches, the raw wounds. Several jurors winced and looked away. One elderly woman closed her eyes, visibly disturbed by the images. Hartford's opening statement was defensive and unconvincing. He argued that accidents happened, that dogs sometimes behaved unpredictably even when properly contained, and that there was no evidence Richardson had acted with anything other than reasonable care. His argument fell flat. Even as he spoke, could see jurors shaking their heads slightly, their body language suggesting they weren't buying his narrative. The first day of testimony focused on medical evidence. Dr. Michael, no relation to David, about the severity of Sarah's injuries, the surgical procedures required, and the permanent scarring. He described the dangerousness of the attack, explaining that the bite to her thigh had come dangerously close to her femoral artery. "If this bite had been even half an inch to the side, doctor, the dog's teeth likely would have punctured a major artery. The child could have bled to death in her front yard within minutes. We're fortunate she survived this attack at all." The second day brought animal control officers who about the 6 citations issued to Richardson, about the documented complaints, about the specific instructions given to Richardson to either train his dog or improve containment. Their testimony was clinical but damaging, painting a picture of a man repeatedly warned and repeatedly doing nothing. By the third day, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The evidence was relentlessly one-sided. There was no compelling counter-narrative from the defense, no explanation for Richardson's negligence that made sense. The insurance company's strategy of minimizing and dismissing now seemed callous and inappropriate given the overwhelming documentation of Richardson's knowledge and indifference. Then came Sarah. She entered the courtroom at 10:30 a.m. on Thursday, January 16th. She wore a simple pale blue dress that Jennifer had carefully chosen, something that made Sarah look young and innocent without appearing artificial or staged. Mr. was not permitted in the courtroom, so Jennifer had given Sarah a small smooth stone to hold, something tactile to ground her, to give her hand something to do. Sarah was visibly terrified. Her small frame seemed to shrink as she walked to the witness stand, accompanied by a court-appointed child advocate. Judge spoke to her gently, explaining what would happen, assuring her that she could ask for breaks if she needed them, that she was in a safe place. David began his examination with slow, gentle questions designed to establish Sarah's credibility and help the jury understand who she was as a person, not just as a victim. "What's your name?" asked softly. "Sarah Mitchell," came the small voice. "How old are you, Sarah?" "I'm 7 years old." "What do you like to do, Sarah? What are some of your favorite things?" "I like to read and draw. I like to sing. I like to play outside." The past tense did not escape the juror's notice. Continued gently, establishing the timeline of June 15th. He asked Sarah about playing in her yard, about about the beautiful day it had been. "Can you tell me what happened when Kaiser came into your yard?" asked, his voice incredibly gentle, giving Sarah permission to describe the trauma. Sarah took a shaky breath. Her hands trembled as she gripped the small stone. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, and the entire courtroom leaned forward to hear her. "He came really fast," Sarah whispered. "He was really big and really scary. He had his teeth showing. He was growling so loud, I couldn't move. I was too scared to move." "What happened next?" asked gently. Sarah's voice broke. "He bit me. It hurt so much. I couldn't get away. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. He bit my leg too. There was so much blood, I thought he was going to kill me." Several jurors had tears streaming down their faces. One woman, a mother of 3, was sobbing quietly. An elderly juror stared at Richardson with unconcealed contempt. "Are you okay?" asked Sarah gently. "Can I have a break?" Sarah whispered. Judge immediately granted a 15-minute recess. During that break, Sarah sat in a private room with the child advocate and Jennifer, holding Mr., breathing deeply, regaining her composure. When testimony resumed, Hartford had to conduct cross-examination. The insurance company's strategy was to suggest that Sarah had somehow provoked the attack or that she'd been careless in some way. But as Hartford began his questions, Judge intervened. "Mr. Hartford," the judge said coolly, "I will not have you attacking a 7-year-old child on the witness stand. You may ask relevant questions about the incident itself, but any attempt to blame a child for being attacked by a dog will result in sanctions. Do you understand?" Hartford understood. His cross-examination was brief and ineffectual. He asked a few questions about whether Sarah had been running or playing loudly, and Sarah answered simply and honestly that she'd just been playing with her toy bunny. When Sarah was excused from the stand, she walked back to where her parents sat. Jennifer wrapped her arms around her daughter, and Sarah buried her face against her mother's chest, trembling with the exhaustion of reliving her trauma in front of a room full of strangers. But something had shifted in the courtroom. The jurors had connected with Sarah on a fundamental human level. They understood, in a visceral and emotional way, what this child had suffered. They saw her not as a legal claim or a number. They saw her as a human being, an innocent child whose life had been altered forever by negligence and indifference. Over the remaining days of testimony, the evidence continued to mount. Dr. Sarah about Sarah's psychological injuries, her PTSD symptoms, her anxiety disorders, and her prognosis. She explained that while Sarah would likely make significant progress with continued therapy, the trauma would likely affect her for years to come, possibly for the rest of her life. Children are resilient, doctor, but trauma of this magnitude leaves lasting impacts. Sarah will need ongoing professional support. She will likely struggle with anxiety and phobias related to dogs. She may have difficulty with trust and feeling safe in the world. The attack has fundamentally altered her developmental trajectory. By the time closing arguments began, the trial had become less a legal contest and more a moral reckoning. Hartford's closing argument was weak and unconvincing. He tried to appeal to jurors' sense of fairness, arguing that Richardson was just an ordinary homeowner who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to be punished so harshly. His closing argument was powerful and direct. He held up the incriminating emails. He referenced the animal control citations. He reminded the jury of the evidence of deliberate negligence. But more importantly, he asked the jury to think about Sarah, about the little girl who used to sing and draw and play, about the traumatized child they'd seen on the witness stand. Richardson made a choice, said, his voice steady and firm. He chose to ignore warnings. He chose to avoid spending money on training or proper containment. He chose to hope that nothing bad would happen. Well, something bad did happen, and now he needs to understand the real cost of his choices. Sarah Mitchell deserves justice. Her family deserves accountability. And this community deserves to know that negligence has consequences. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with a verdict. The jury had been deliberating for 3 hours and 45 minutes when the note came back to Judge Chambers. The judge read it, nodded, and sent word that the verdict was ready. It was 4:47 p.m. on Friday, January 17th. The courtroom began to fill as word spread that the jury had reached a decision. News reporters rushed in from the hallway where they'd been waiting. The gallery filled with supporters. Sarah sat between her parents, her small hand gripping each of theirs tightly. The jury filed back into the courtroom, and everyone rose. David scanned their faces, looking for any indication of the verdict. Several jurors wouldn't make eye contact with Richardson, which was typically a bad sign for the defendant. One juror, the elderly woman who had been visibly upset by Sarah's testimony, looked directly at Richardson with an expression that could only be described as contempt. The foreperson, a middle-aged man named Thomas Richards who worked as an engineer, stood to read the verdict. Judge asked the standard questions. Had the jury reached a unanimous decision? Were they ready to report their verdict? Richards nodded and began reading from the verdict form. We find the defendant, James Richardson, liable for the injuries sustained by the plaintiff, Sarah Mitchell, and we award damages in the amount of $340,000. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, excited murmurs. It was the largest award Judge had seen in her 20-year career on the bench. David grabbed Mark and Jennifer's hands. Jennifer began crying tears of relief, tears of vindication, tears of hope that perhaps, finally, Sarah could begin to heal knowing that her suffering had been recognized and addressed. Sarah didn't fully understand what had happened, She looked up at her parents' faces, saw her mother crying, and became confused. "Is it over?" she asked. "Did we win?" "Yes, baby," Mark said, his own voice thick with emotion. "We won. The jury believes us. They understand what happened to you." Richardson looked pale and shocked. Hartford whispered urgently to his client, presumably explaining the implications of such a large verdict. The insurance company would be paying this, not Richardson personally, but the verdict sent a clear message. The jury believed the evidence, they understood the severity of Sarah's injuries, and they were not sympathetic to Richardson's negligence. As Judge dismissed the jury and began to explain the post-trial procedures, something unexpected happened. Hartford stood up and approached the bench. He spoke quietly to Judge, and the judge's expression shifted to one of skepticism. After a brief exchange, Hartford returned to the defense table. "Your Honor," Hartford announced, his voice loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "my client would like to make a statement to the court before we conclude today's proceedings." Judge looked surprised but nodded permission. Richardson stood shakily and approached the microphone. His face was flushed, and his hands trembled noticeably. He looked directly at Sarah, then at Mark and Jennifer. I don't know what to say," Richardson began, his voice wavering. "I never wanted this to happen. I made mistakes. I should have fixed the fence. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have done more about Kaiser's behavior. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for what happened to Sarah." It wasn't a particularly eloquent apology, and it came far too late to change the verdict. But it was something, an acknowledgement of guilt, a recognition of wrongdoing. Judge nodded, accepting the statement without comment. But then, as Richardson was being led back to his seat by Hartford, something extraordinary and completely unexpected occurred. Robert Hartford, apparently emboldened by the emotions of the moment or perhaps by some misguided attempt at a final dramatic gesture to appeal to the jury, made an announcement that would prove to be catastrophically ill-advised. "Your Honor," Hartford said, "I would like to demonstrate to the court and to the jury the difference between a properly trained, controlled dog and an uncontrolled animal like Kaiser. I have arranged for Portland police officer and his K9 unit dog, a German shepherd named Duke, to be present in the courthouse. With your permission, I would like to bring the dog into the courtroom to demonstrate how a trained police dog behaves compared to Kaiser's aggressive temperament." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Judge's expression hardened visibly. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Hartford. Are you attempting to make some kind of argument about animal behavior? The verdict has already been rendered. Why would you be making this demonstration now?" "To establish that Kaiser's attack was unusual, that a properly trained dog wouldn't behave the way Kaiser did," Hartford explained, looking increasingly flustered. "Officer is a professional and Duke is extensively trained. This is simply to show the distinction." Judge shook her head slowly, visibly disapproving of the tactic. "This seems unnecessary and potentially disruptive, but I will allow it under the condition that officer maintains complete control of the animal and that the dog is never brought within 10 feet of the plaintiff and her family. Is that understood?" Hartford agreed eagerly, seemingly relieved that the judge had granted permission. What Hartford didn't seem to understand, and what would become immediately apparent, was that bringing a large German shepherd into a courtroom full of people would have unpredictable consequences. Officer entered the courtroom with Duke, a massive black and tan German shepherd similar in size and coloring to Kaiser. Officer carried the dog's leash and spoke in low, confident tones, assuring everyone that Duke was well trained and under complete control. The officer walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, demonstrating Duke's calm demeanor, his attentiveness to command, his apparent docility. Sarah watched the dog enter the courtroom, and her entire body went rigid. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands gripped her parents' arms so tightly her fingernails drew blood. The moment she saw the massive dog, her mind didn't register, trained police dog her mind registered predator and danger. Officer walked Duke closer to the front of the courtroom, speaking to the judge about the dog's training and controlled temperament. As they approached the area near the prosecution table, something unexpected happened. Perhaps the dog sensed Sarah's fear and anxiety. Perhaps the stress and emotion in the courtroom affected the animal. Perhaps it was simply an unfortunate moment of lost control. But Duke suddenly lunged, straining against his leash with tremendous force, his body moving directly towards Sarah. Officer immediately yanked back on the leash, trying to regain control, but for a crucial second or two, Duke had broken free of his heel and was charging toward the small girl. The dog's leash snapped taut, halting his forward momentum, but not before Sarah screamed, a primal, terrified sound that echoed through the courtroom and seemed to freeze everyone in place for an instant. Sarah threw herself into Jennifer's arms, her entire body convulsing with terror. "Get him away! Get him away! He's going to bite me! He's going to bite me!" she screamed, her voice raw with fear. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. People gasped. Several spectators stood up in shock. Judge's face turned a deep shade of red with fury. "Remove that animal from my courtroom immediately," Judge shouted, her voice commanding and absolute. Officer quickly led Duke back out of the courtroom, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor. I don't know what happened. Duke has never behaved that way before." Judge was not interested in explanations. "I want that animal and its handler out of this building within 5 minutes." As the dog was being removed, Sarah continued to sob against her mother's chest, her entire body shaking with the aftermath of terror. The courtroom had fallen silent except for Sarah's crying. The moment that Hartford had intended as a demonstration of controlled animal behavior had instead become a tragic illustration of the very real trauma that Sarah still carried with her. Jennifer held her daughter, whispering reassurances, rocking her gently. Mark's arm was around both of them, his face a mask of rage directed at Hartford and his catastrophically bad decision. Judge looked absolutely furious. She gestured for Hartford to approach the bench. Their conversation was inaudible to the courtroom, but even from a distance it was clear the judge was expressing extreme displeasure. Hartford's face grew increasingly red, and he repeatedly nodded, looking chastened. After what felt like an eternity to Sarah, though it was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the dog was completely removed from the courthouse. The courtroom began to settle slightly. Sarah was still trembling, still crying, but her breathing was beginning to slow. Judge spoke from the bench, her voice calm but with an edge of controlled fury. "This court is adjourned. However, before we conclude, I want to make something clear to everyone present. That demonstration was inappropriate, ill-advised, and deeply harmful to a traumatized child. Mr. Hartford, I am referring this matter to the Bar Association for review of your conduct. Bringing a large dog into a courtroom where a child with documented dog-related trauma was present was not only professionally irresponsible, it was cruel." She looked directly at Sarah and her expression softened considerably. "Sarah, sweetheart, I want you to know that what just happened was not your fault. You were very brave today. You are safe now." As the court was being cleared, Mark and Jennifer sat with Sarah, holding her, letting her cry. Jennifer made a decision at that moment. She would stay with Sarah, would not leave her side, would help her process this new trauma layered on top of the original attack. But then something happened that would change the trajectory of the entire case in an unexpected way. As Judge was gathering her papers to leave the bench, she looked over at Sarah one more time and asked gently, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Sarah looked up through her tears, her small face streaked with crying, her eyes red and swollen. In that moment of complete vulnerability, with her sense of safety shattered again, Sarah looked at the judge with absolute honesty and whispered 2 words that would reverberate through the entire case and eventually through the entire community. "I'm sorry." Moment Sarah whispered those two words, "I'm sorry," the courtroom fell into stunned silence. The emotional weight of those simple words seemed to crash down upon everyone present simultaneously. Sarah, a child who had been savagely attacked, who had suffered severe trauma, who had been forced to relive her horror in court, was apologizing, not for anything she had done, not because she was at fault, but because she was so profoundly afraid that she felt compelled to apologize for her very human reaction to terror. Judge's face changed in that instant. Her stern judicial expression softened into something deeper, a profound recognition of the injustice that had been done to this child. She set down her papers and looked directly at Sarah with compassion that transcended the formality of the courtroom. "You have nothing to apologize for, Sarah," the judge said quietly, her voice carrying a gentleness that made several people in the courtroom begin to cry. "You were brave today, very brave." But the impact of Sarah's words extended far beyond that courtroom moment. A court reporter had been transcribing every word of the proceeding, and the full transcript, including Sarah's apology, was filed as part of the public record. The local news stations, which had been following the case closely, seized upon this moment. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Portland and across Oregon. The image of a terrified, traumatized child apologizing for being afraid became the symbol of her entire case. A symbol of innocence destroyed, of a system that had failed to protect her until it was almost too late, and of the power of truth and vulnerability to move people's hearts. The Bar Association did indeed open an investigation into Robert Hartford's conduct. The proceedings revealed that Hartford had acted against the explicit advice of his insurance company supervisors, who had warned him that bringing the dog into the courtroom would be inappropriate and potentially harmful. Hartford had proceeded anyway, apparently believing he could salvage the case through this dramatic gesture. The Bar Association ultimately suspended Hartford's license to practice law for 6 months, a significant professional consequence that sent a message throughout the legal community about the importance of protecting vulnerable witnesses, particularly children. In the days following the trial, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah's story, crystallized around those two simple words of apology, began to inspire a grassroots movement for legislative change. Community members, child advocates, and animal welfare organizations began reaching out to Oregon state legislators, demanding stronger protections for children against dangerous dogs and more accountability for negligent pet owners. Dr. Sarah's psychologist, began working with various organizations to develop educational materials about dog bite prevention and trauma recovery. She gave presentations to school boards, parent groups, and community organizations, always centering her discussion around Sarah's case as an example of the devastating impact of preventable animal attacks on children. 3 months after the trial, Oregon State Representative Maria Santos introduced a bill in the Oregon House of Representatives. The bill, which quickly became known as Sarah's Law, addressed multiple aspects of dog owner liability and animal control procedures. The key provisions included: first, any dog owner with a documented history of aggressive behavior toward people would be required to carry at minimum $300,000 in liability insurance. This would ensure that victims of attacks by known dangerous dogs would have resources for medical care and recovery. Second, animal control officers would be given expanded authority to issue emergency containment orders for dogs that had been the subject of multiple complaints or citations. These orders would require owners to either rehome the animal or implement professional containment measures, with regular inspections to verify compliance. Third, failure to comply with animal control orders would result in escalating fines, and repeated violations would result in mandatory animal seizure and either behavioral evaluation or humane euthanasia, depending on the animal's assessment. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly for victims, The law would establish a victim support fund to help people who had been injured by animals receive counseling, medical treatment, and compensation for lost quality of life. Sarah's law passed the Oregon House with overwhelming bipartisan support in June. When it reached the Senate, Senator David, who had 2 young children of his own, became its champion. The senator brought Sarah and her family to the state capitol to testify about the impact of the attack and the importance of stronger protections. Sarah, now 8 years old, stood before the Senate Education and Workforce Committee, and in her small but clear voice, described what it felt like to be afraid of dogs, to have nightmares every night, to be unable to play outside. "I just want other kids to be safe," Sarah said simply. "I don't want other kids to get hurt like I did." The Senate passed Sarah's law unanimously on September 15th. Governor Tina signed it into law on October 1st, with Sarah and her family present at the signing ceremony. Sarah stood next to the governor as she signed the bill, and photographers captured the moment for newspapers and television stations across the state. The image of the small girl watching the governor sign a bill that bore her name became iconic, a symbol of how one child's courage and vulnerability could inspire systemic change. In the months following the law's passage, Sarah began her own healing journey in earnest. Doctor continued to work with her, and the therapy became less about processing trauma and more about building resilience and learning to live with the memories without being controlled by them. Jennifer enrolled Sarah in a specialized dog bite recovery program that combined exposure therapy with working with certified therapy dogs, animals specially trained and temperamentally selected to help trauma survivors gradually overcome their fear. The first time Sarah met Bella, a gentle, elderly golden retriever who served as a therapy dog, she was terrified. She sat in a chair across the room from the dog, her entire body rigid, her breathing shallow. The therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Lisa, moved slowly and gently. "You don't have to pet her today," Doctor assured Sarah. "You just have to be in the same room with her. That's enough." For the first 3 sessions, Sarah simply sat in the room with Bella while the therapist talked to her about her feelings. Gradually, over weeks of sessions, Sarah began to move closer to the dog. She held the leash. She watched as Bella ate from her bowl. She saw that Bella was gentle, that she sought affection rather than attacking, that she wagged her tail in friendliness rather than aggression. By her 10th session, Sarah tentatively reached out and pet Bella's head. The dog turned and licked her hand gently, and Sarah began to cry, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that not all dogs were dangerous, that healing was possible, and that she could reclaim parts of her childhood that she thought had been stolen forever. 5 years after the attack, Sarah Mitchell stood before an auditorium full of high school students at Lincoln High School in Portland. She was 14 years old now, tall and confident, with a presence that belied her years. She spoke about the attack, about the trauma, about her journey through therapy and recovery. She talked about Sarah's law and its impact on animal control procedures throughout Oregon. But most importantly, she talked about resilience, about the power of speaking up, about the importance of holding people accountable for their negligence and indifference. "I was 7 years old when Kaiser attacked me," Sarah said, her voice steady and strong. "I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be okay again. But with help from my family, from doctor, from my attorney, Mr., and from this community, I learned that trauma doesn't have to define you. You can heal. You can grow. You can transform your pain into something that helps others." Several students approached her after her presentation with their own stories of trauma and fear. Sarah listened to each one, her empathy and understanding evident in her eyes. She had become an advocate, a voice for vulnerable children, a living testament to the power of courage and resilience. James Richardson eventually sold his house and moved out of Oregon. He paid the settlement amount to the insurance company, which covered the judgment. Kaiser was seized by animal control and, after a formal behavioral evaluation, was humanely euthanized, a decision that, while tragic, ensured that the dangerous dog could never attack another child. The Mitchell family donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish the Sarah Mitchell Fund for Victim Support at the County Animal Control Office. This fund provided counseling, medical care, and financial assistance to children and families who had been injured by animals. Over the following years, the fund helped dozens of families recover from animal attack trauma. Mark and Jennifer Mitchell watched their daughter transform from a traumatized, fearful child into a young woman of courage and purpose. They saw the nightmares decrease, the anxiety gradually diminish, and their daughter's natural joy and resilience gradually return. Sarah never fully forgot what happened to her. The scars on her arm remained as a physical reminder, but she learned to live with her memories without being defined by them. On the 5th anniversary of the attack, Sarah returned to Riverside Elementary School, where she had been a second grader when Kaiser attacked her. She spoke to the current second-grade classes about dog safety, about recognizing dangerous situations, and about the importance of asking for help when they were afraid. The children listened with the rapt attention that only young children can give to someone they see as a hero. Sarah's law had been refined and expanded since its initial passage. Other states, inspired by Oregon's comprehensive approach, began enacting similar legislation. Animal welfare advocates pointed to Oregon as a model for how to balance protecting children while also addressing the root causes of dangerous dog behavior: inadequate training, poor containment, and owner negligence. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Sarah's case wasn't the law, as important as that was. It was the message that Sarah's courage had sent to every traumatized child, every vulnerable person, every victim of negligence, that your pain matters, that your voice matters, that speaking your truth, even if it's just 2 simple words, can change the world. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her journey, she would often reflect on that moment in the courtroom when she'd whispered, "I'm sorry," to the judge. She would explain that she hadn't fully understood what those words meant at the time, that she'd been apologizing for being afraid, for being human, for being traumatized. But in retrospect, she understood that those 2 words had encapsulated everything about her case: the innocence of childhood destroyed, the vulnerability of victims who dared to speak up, and the transformative power of truth. Sarah Mitchell had been a victim of negligence and indifference, but she had become an advocate for change, a voice for the voiceless, and a living embodiment of the possibility that trauma can be transformed into purpose, that fear can be overcome through courage, and that one person's willingness to speak the truth can create justice that extends far beyond a single courtroom.